It's been about a week since I started this project and came back from C2E2, and I'm just going to give you my weekly update. It's been about a month since I started this King Thranduil project, and, well, the last month hasn't gotten me very far. It is week 15 or so on this King Thranduil build. First 4 days, 5 days, hand embroidering 4 yards of fabric, or 2 yards, and I still got another 2 yards. I spent 4 weeks hand embroidering and hand beading this collar, but the collar is almost finished, and we have leaves. We now have 55 individually hand-corded, beaded, and embroidered leaves. A lot of issues where I yelled at it a whole bunch, and I had a lot of moments of just, I want to give up. But I didn't give up. I kind of persevered through and was like, all right, how can I fix this? And eventually, it worked out. So how does one accidentally spend 9 months making one costume? I say accidentally because this costume was indeed supposed to take 1 month. It was supposed to be a fun little build with maybe a little bit of embroidery, some foam work, and a little bit of like sewing work. That was it. Just using fun fabrics, right? And you know, it started out that way. It really did. But then it became much more, and now we are here. So if you're curious, this project, it began in August of 2022, last year. I bought and sourced the fabrics in July, and they were all from the New York City Garment District during the heat wave in July, and I remember that really vividly because I was sweating holding the, like, Mood fabrics bag that you get when you spend too much money at Mood. And I was just walking around New York so excited to start this project, but I still had a little bit of work to do before C2E2 2022, before the Crown Championships of Cosplay that year, because, of course one does. If you don't know, that is where all the people who are in that contest chaos sewing, or chaos upgrading things at the very last minute. Very common for that competition. But I finished everything on Thursday. Before, you know, I packed everything on Thursday. So Thursday morning, I start cutting out and sewing panels together in this, like, gorgeous, like, silk taffeta with embroidered flowers on it. That's kind of what dictated the entire project, was that brown silk taffeta on the coat. And so I started sewing the panels together because I was really eager to get started on it. One, because having 5 yards of taffeta, having 5 yards of brocade sitting in your basement can get a little, there's a lot of fabric. So I just wanted to get started to get rid of the fabric. What they don't warn you about is after finishing something like the build that I competed that year at Crown Championships, is you feel a little empty afterwards. And so when I got back home from C2E2, I really desperately wanted to start something. And I had this sitting, and I started beading some stuff, and then I got distracted. The first thing I did for this project was I made and started embroidering these satin stitch, like puff paint embroidery facing pieces on the sleeve, actually, of the coat. And so I sewed one. I vividly remember sewing it and just like going at it for 4 days straight, like watching What Next in Fashion and a whole bunch of stuff, just like, because I hated it. It was so monotonous. I don't like doing like satin stitch embroidery that takes forever, unless I'm like doing it on the side with something else and giving myself weeks of time to do it. So I did one. I started the second. I got maybe a quarter of the way done. I was like, I'm done. I'm moving on to something else and coming back to this. And so I did. Now, the leaf cape wasn't in the original build. So the leaf cape was not supposed to be as convoluted as it ended up becoming. I think I had planned for it to be 1 week. I found this image of Cersei with this beautifully embroidered collar on the internet, of course, you know, scrolling through Pinterest, and my brain immediately went, oh my god, I want that on Thranduil. Like, could you imagine? And so, yeah, I draped. And so I draped on my duct tape mannequin, my lopsided duct tape mannequin, a little bit of, like, line work. And then it became, you know, the cape, the pauldrons, the cape, the pauldrons. And then, you know, line work. I then cut it out of excess silk from Anakin when I finished the pants, which were done in, like, silver silk dupioni. And then I used canvas to back it. I literally just, like, I English stitched them together, right? So I folded both sides under and just top stitched it. I didn't even, like, sew and flip. I just top stitched it. I was like, all right, we're just gonna do this. And so we did it. And then I went to the fabric store thinking, oh yeah, like 3 skeins of silver embroidery floss and a couple of metallics and a little bit of, like, red and green, right? And then, like, what, a few packets of beads? That was gonna suffice, right? I was wrong. I was so wrong. I spent 12 hours that night just like satin and chain stitching a tree one night, and that is when I realized this is gonna take me about 50 times longer than I thought it would. And so we continue. So then throughout the next week, I'll pop in photos and stuff, by the way. Throughout the next week, I was working on this pauldron, adding more beads, using beads in different ways that I'd never used them before, really playing around with it, using different types of beads. I'd never used like stones, I was used to using just like seed beads, so I was finally using all these different beads to combine colors and things, and like stack beads and use beads as like ways to embroider and give texture and all this crazy stuff, you know, the Michelle Carragher stuff. And then I realized that I had sewn the pauldron. I started beading upside down, so suddenly the bottom was round and the top was pointed. So then I added an extra thing at the bottom and I had to combine that, and it looked really nice. And at the very end, you know, I did it for both of them. It was really pretty. It worked out, but it just took forever. And then I did the collar. Originally, the collar was supposed to be just kind of like embroidered and a little bit beaded. And then I started embroidering it after covering it in like so many different like Sharpie marks. Because yes, I did Sharpie on the collar. I'm sorry. I just started embroidering little swirls. After the embroidering little swirls, I started beading around those swirls. Something looked off, and suddenly I was beading and embroidering the entirety of the front piece of the collar. And then the back happened, and just same thing happened. It just kept going and going. And, you know, this is what happens when you give me unlimited amount of time to do something, because I didn't have any deadlines set for this project yet, because I thought the leaf cape would be the only hard thing. I remember going to a convention during this time just to like do something, because this was during September where things, you know, convention season dies after Dragon Con for a little bit. So convention season was over for the summer. I was still kind of empty after C2E2, and I just felt really sad because, you know, it's weird. These big conventions are so huge. You do these huge things and suddenly you're back to what is kind of a sad existence of being a nerd in real life or on the internet. And so I was very empty. I went to one convention just for a day to have some fun and do a competition and, you know, yay, conventions. And I remember just thinking after that competition, being so motivated to get everything done, because I started working on these leaves. There were like originally 50 leaves. And then now there's 68 because I kept having to add more because there were parts where they were still like red space from the actual satin cape. So I just kept making leaves. I think I made, 68. And then I sewed each one on. I did everything. Each one was corded with like stuff. It had couching, it had beading, it had everything. Every single leaf was individually handcrafted with a different design intentionally. That was the whole point. And I mean, it worked out. The leaf cape, I think, is my favorite part of this project because it just kind of brought everything together and it started the madness. Originally, this was supposed to be very different. So I have my build book with me. We're gonna go into the second picture. Design number 2. So now we're in design number 2 officially, which is really, really cool. So yeah, this is wild. This is a very strange and wild part. So this is where we hit the wild, wild west of this costume. With the leaf cape being over about the first week of October, we enter into this strange territory of, is this gonna get done? Or is it not gonna get done ever? And so for me, what happened was I signed up for a cosplay contest in December to give myself a deadline to stop working. I had to give myself a deadline, otherwise I would continue working for like ages. So the coat was now started. Now I realized when I was sewing it, the feedback I got from Crown that year was, your silk was puckered. And I was like, oh crap, because the silk had actually also puckered a little bit on Thranduil while I was sewing him. Now, part of that is the fabric's fault. Can't do anything about the fact that the embroidery on the fabric that I bought from the garment district was a little bit puckered. You could hide that, but my own seams looked like trash. So what I did, I started with these little gimp cord pieces and I cut out a little bit of the silk and then I cut out the gimp cord. I started embroidering trees. Each tree is different. Each tree had a different color scheme. There was a lot of tiny little things on each tree that was different. And as I was embroidering each tree, I'd unpick that seam. Now, mind you, I had finished the seam and done the seam, so I had to unpick well, my serger's broken. I had to unpick zigzag stitches and straight stitches. So each seam, as I started doing the embroidery pieces, I started picking and unpicking each seam. I'd bought brown cotton, sort of like poly cotton, just to interline it with, and it was very important that I did so. That was a week and a half of madness, was these bottom pieces, but they turned out really, really beautiful, and I'm so happy I did them. I know one of the biggest feedbacks I always get is, it's too much, but for me, there is no such thing as too much, and I am very proud of this costume. But continuing, now with everything unpicked, I said, okay, what about the sleeves? So then I started to do a beading down the sleeve, down the side of the sleeve, just because it's there. What else are you gonna do with the sleeve, right? No, I did way too much of the sleeve, but I started beading using the red seed beads and these like beautiful bronze bugle beads, and I just went down outlining each one with 2 layers of bugles, a layer of seed, and just rotating down the middle, right? Absolutely gorgeous. It turned out, I mean, I loved it. It was a beautiful little moment. It was a very Michelle Carragher-esque thing to do. But this took forever. So this was like starting, I remember having an event during this time and having to like stop beading for like 5 minutes. I was just like speed beading this thing because I just did not want to look at a bead ever again, specifically for the sleeves, because I don't know why, but the sleeves alone took a week and a half just to like get both sleeves. And I was working every waking moment of my every day, because at this point, if I was going to get this to GalaxyCon in December, I had to run. I had to run and speed run this project, which is too bit of a detriment, but it turned out fine in the end, right? So now we are finished with the sleeves. I have the coat constructed again, with inside the pieces. Now we have inner linings, we have everything finished. And what comes next, other than the couching that comes all along the bottom of the pieces? This was something that I'd already intended to do, was having really fancy like couching waves going up and down and like the scroll work of elves. This was on every single other like piece, and it was a really important moment. I remember doing this during like Halloween shows that I was doing, right? I brought my like embroidery hoop, my like giant coat, and I couched for hours during these things because I was just rushing to get it done. And I got it done. I got it done in like 3 or 4 days, because couching, this is where I learned that couching is my favorite embroidery technique, because it goes so much faster than filling in stitches. Now, obviously filling in stitches is probably the better option, but couching goes faster. I'd also, at this time, while I was doing an exhibition with some other costumes, I finished the other sleeve embroidery. Finally, both of the puff paint embroideries that I'd started with originally were done. And so I started attaching things to the coat, and this is what, we're like 3 days out from Halloween, and you're like, so what'd you do on Halloween? I entered my over the garden wall era. Now, starting at this point, this project begins to consume my life, and it's such a fixation of my life. It's a beautiful fixation of my life. I'm gonna be honest with you. I wouldn't trade these last 9 months for the world. It was a beautiful moment. What I started doing was associating either films or music or TV shows to different eras of this costume. And the first one that I remember really vividly is the Over the Garden Wall era, where I was finishing the coat, and I decided to, because it was Halloween, I was doing nothing with friends because I was finishing a coat, but also, yeah, it was kind of a sad Halloween. It was raining. I decided to watch Over the Garden Wall. And honestly, the show profoundly changed my life, because I remember I was making the lining, right? So I was sewing up the lining, and I was pinning it into the coat, and it wasn't fitting right and everything. And I remember watching the show, and then I literally, when the show finished, had to have like a moment of, I'm talking 4 hours of just like straight sobbing. So that's what I remember about that night. It was beautiful. It was a good sobbing, because it affected me in a way that media doesn't really affect me with. And so, yeah. The Over the Garden Wall era begins now. What happens now is that the lining happens 4 times. I sew it by machine 3 times. Every single one of those sucked. So I unpicked it. I unpicked any other stitching, any understitching, any top stitching. I did it again. Sucked. Tried a 3rd time. Bad. Why does it look bad? And so I give up, because I wanted to do it by machine because it would go faster. And then I was like, nope, we're gonna do it by hand. So I decided to, in the end, hand fell my lining, which was, I think, the best option I could do, because it turned out really neat. This was, I think, the neatest like lining job I've done in a very long time, so I'm very, very proud of it. So after that, after we do all the lining work, I start just sewing on trims for 3 days, and I swear the trim that I chose for the front is the like thickest trim you've ever experienced. It was so hard to sew. So for like 3 days, I'm just sewing on trims and ribbons and finishings on this thing because I thought I was done. And then I started working on the collar. Now the collar, I wanted to have a little fancy thing here. So yeah, the collar was a bit of a draft. And then I pad stitched out some of this stuff and it wasn't pad stitching properly. I said, we're gonna address that later because I had to get working on this robe. I had 1 month, less than 1 month before GalaxyCon, before I had to compete this whole thing in front of people. And this robe was like the bane of my existence for a month. So what happened? I drafted like a 15 paneled like Thranduil coat, you know, with the panels and everything, the piping, and I was like, oh, it's gonna be so good. I was so neat and I was clean, I was sewing it. And I put it on the mannequin and suddenly the front panels are skewing like this. Something went wrong up here in the hip and it's skewing the panels so that they close in overlap. We don't want that. So I spent a day lamenting. I had many, many different breakdowns, many sadness moments because this fabric that I was using was very expensive. It was for the Mood fabric and I'd already made my pattern and everything, but I was using a different pattern so it didn't work. And I learned my lesson. You actually have to fit the mock-up pattern because the second one turned a lot better. But yeah, so, but I decided to continue because the fabric was expensive. And at this point I could not do anything else. I had to continue. So yeah, I continued trying to just fit it a little bit and like make it work. I pulled in all these seams to like make the overlap go from like this to like this. So it was just like slightly overlapping. I did pad stitching down the front. I did like hip padding. And in the end, it was okay. It wasn't great, but it worked. Now, the coat itself is a different story. It is basically a corset, and that wasn't a great idea. So I'm very glad this wasn't the final coat. So at this point, I am now like beading and embroidering a whole bunch of stuff here and down at the bottom, and then the lining. When you're lining, don't do things where it's individually like scalloped. This was a nightmare. I did the lining by hand. I don't want to do this again. And this is also where I learned that maybe canvas, like actual drill canvas, is not the best interlining for brocades. Because I've been using it for a while, and this is the project where I finally said, no, this is not it anymore. I've got a new Thranduil robe that's using linen. So, I have done what I can. I sewed a zipper in about 5 times. Each one sucked more and more, but eventually we figured it out and I was very excited. So we get to the end where I can do a little bit of detail work, rework a staff, because there's no way boots, pants, or new staffs were gonna happen in this time. So the leaves have changed. It is now full on like winter. There was already a snowstorm like earlier in that month. Like it was no longer fall. I had worked for 4 months straight at this point. No longer fall, it is winter, and I am still on a single costume. Now, this is where we enter the Interstellar/Cornfield Chase era, which is the song that I associate with this little December period of time before the madness hit. So this December period of time is the interstellar period of time, or the interstellar era, as we might say, because I was beading this little brooch to go in the back because I'd finally completed all of this. So I was beading a little brooch in the back to cover up the wig. And we watched Interstellar at that moment, and you know, I like movies that are weird and have fun soundtracks and are kind of sad, and this was one of those. It made me question my whole existence. But that aside, I go to GalaxyCon. It is a fun convention. I design a whole new costume in that time, all that fun stuff, and I get feedback. I compete, I get feedback. I need more techniques. Wonderful. Don't tell me that, because I will legitimately go insane. So, I was told about wigs when I was, talking. They were like, so, have you ever made wigs? I was like, no. Thought has maybe crossed my mind, but not really stayed there. And so I was given the resources and the tools on how to start this whole concept of what I call madness, basically. And so I started this madness first by, I think before I went to GalaxyCon, I ordered a couple of old work pieces, some new brocade, stuff like that, because the robe was just causing me so much, like, internal mental turmoil, because I hated it. I was like, I hate everything about this. So I just ordered new stuff to make a new robe to actually like it, because if you know anything about competitive cosplay and, like, specifically internationals, is that you can spend the money. I give myself a higher budget for international cosplays because I know that I need them to be absolute perfection, because any tiny little thing will dock you and like you'll lose your place, right? So it's very important. So I get home, it's like December, and I decide to just start on the new robe immediately when I get home. And so I start on this crazy new robe. Couching, cord, I had all this stuff. I patterned it out, I simplified it a whole bunch. Now there's only 6 panels in front on each side, so there's still 12 panels, but not 30 panels, so it's great. And I start couching the whole thing. I go through, I make shoulder pads. This turned out so much better, which is great. So sometimes simplifying things is the best thing you can do. Simplified it all, and yeah, I think at this point in time, I actually went back to work on Loki for a little bit, because I had a different thing that I wanted to do for a different contest. All this fun stuff, right? So I went and I was just like at Loki, in Loki World for a bit, which was a nightmare, because if you know anything about making Lokis, you know that. But yeah, and then I come back. Suddenly, it is very cold, and I very vividly remember this like time where I had to move my workspace into a warmer room because it was so freezing outside. There was a whole bunch of stuff happening, and for like 4 days I was trapped, and I was just beading things because I decided to add all the beads at the hem of this coat. And yeah, the coat did eventually turn out really nice. I did some of the nicest lining work of my life. And then we'll get to what happens with the coat in a bit. So I move on to a couple of different projects. I work on some stuff for the Dune costume I'm working on now. And I order a bunch of stuff, and I order wig stuff. So first wig I made was actually not for Thranduil, it was for Loki. My first wig was a Loki wig because I wanted to practice before doing anything on my crown piece. And so for 10 days straight, I am tying hairs into wigs, into caps. And my entire life for the first few days was fun. This was fun. And then by like day 4, everything sucked. So hand tying wigs is a thing that I do often now. I'm doing another one in a little bit. I'm waiting it. And the first 4 days, I'm like perfectly happy and content, just like going away, like hand tying wigs. And then by like the 5th like day, by like the 40th hour, I like literally want to just knock it over and run away. So how many more wigs am I planning to tie? I've got 2 more that I want to tie. More after that. But yeah, and so I make the Loki wig. I go the Loki wig, and then what I had after that was I had to start working on the Thranduil wig. So I had started tying it just like at night when I was watching movies or whatever, and then working on boots, staff. Oh, yeah, the staff. And then I finished the robe. So after I get home from... No, I think it was before. So during the time between finishing Loki for OhioCon, after finishing Loki for con and then starting on Thranduil, I was working on these little cuffs for the thing because I have so many leftover beads. I was like, how do I use these? So I started working on cuffs. They turned out really nice. I used like beads and rings and warbler, and I did some jewelry stuff, and then I started working on, I think, the staff after that. So this is now like February. All of January was spent mostly working on Loki and then tying a wig and then a little bit of like staff and cuff work. And then I finished working on the staff. The staff took a while, but you know, it didn't take that long actually. It was just a lot of warbler and a lot of trying stuff and masking tape and watching Barbie Life in the Dream House at about 2 a.m. while masking taping things, because masking tape actually makes really nice wood texture. So yeah, that was fun. Sanded a whole bunch. Hated it, had to resand a whole bunch. Hated that again, had to resand a whole bunch. And I painted it like 5 times. That was fun. But it turned out really nice. I'm very, very pleased with the staff. And yeah, get some updates later. But yeah. And so now we work on the pants. So now we're doing all the extra stuff that I wanted to do. So the pants, I wanted to add smocking because again, like they were saying, I needed more techniques. So while the wig was standing there like half tied, I was smocking some pants. I was using the leftovers of the red silk that I had. I have swatches. I could actually use swatches. Right. Leftovers of the red silk that I had, right? So, leftovers of this silk. Yeah. I had leftovers. I had about a yard folded. So I just cut it in half and smocked up the yard into like nice little round things. Beaded the whole thing. It took like 4 days. Shouldn't have taken that long, but it took that long. And then I couched more. The pants were nice. I learned that crotch adjustments were a thing, so crotch adjustments are really important. Very nice. And then, with all of that, I worked on a pair of boots. I started beading some parts of the boots. I started adding things on the boots. I didn't really know what I was doing with the boots, but I had to do something because I had my next competition with this costume coming up so I could get feedback. And crown applications were coming up, and I was like, oh goodness, I have to get this in. So, I take pictures one day, and I hated everything about this costume because suddenly all I saw was every single flaw that was in this costume. And that's not fun, but it happens more than, you want, and so I looked back at it and said, okay, how do we fix this? And the answer was surgery on the coat. So I unpicked the bottom, I put like canvas and like interfacing in here. I pad stitched it all down so that there's like structure on the coat, just a little bit, Close up the entire bottom again, add the ribbon again. It was a lot, and I do a little bit of work on the staff, and then I finished the wig, which was also madness because this wig I had to be so particular about the hairline that like this much took 8 hours. So, that's a thing that happens. That was fun. That was not fun. And then we come to the concept of I have to take pictures for this to send into the application. And so, despite hating everything and being the most anxious human being ever, I sent in my pictures. I was like, okay, this is what I have. This is a costume that is like 90% done. Next weekend I had my convention for feedback. And so I compete, but that Friday I get the email that was like, hey, you're in. And I was like, oh God. Because that means that madness begins after this convention. So I compete, I get my feedback, I do all the feedback things that they say. I needed to add a little more in the wig. I needed to fix the staff a little bit. Perfect. We have a month until C2. So, I started by making different costumes. I started by working on a different costume for C2E2 because I was like, I'm done. And then halfway through, I was doing a little bit of extra work every day, and then I began to realize that I was like, I don't like my boots. What if we added another technique and used the leather that I've been hoarding for a year? So I had this gold hide of leather. I bought it at Ren Faire in hopes to use it after finishing Thranduil, and obviously we're still in Thranduil world, so I was like, oh God, okay. I decide to fully hand make boots, like extras on boots. I didn't make boots yet, that's coming. So I punched holes in leather. I learned how to saddle stitch. I learned all this stuff to like make these boots. And then I couched around the edges, and then my hands were so raw by the end of it, just by like saddle stitching everything. And oh my God. The thing is that the boots turned out really nice, and I'm so happy that I decided to do all of that leather stitching and all that couching on the leather. It was a really good thing to do because it worked out. But it was a lot. And this is where I said, okay, we're done. But we weren't done. I added more on the staff because I realized it was kind of ugly, and I made a giant sandworm not for this costume, but like for this convention. And I think I went back and tied the wig a few more times just to add more hair. And then we come to I finish all the con crunching for Senator Anakin Skywalker, and the last day before the convention, I freak out And Wednesday night, I'm making jewelry for the hair. I'm braiding up the wig. I'm doing all this crazy stuff. I mean, like, this was the moment for this costume because this was what it was made for at this point. There was nothing else in my arsenal that was this detailed, this insane. And so the day of, I'm still working. It is Thursday. I have to leave in an hour to drive. I make Warbler rings to add onto the fingers of this costume because it just, nothing ever felt adequate enough. I knew I got a little detail blind, but nothing felt adequate enough. And, you know, that can happen. I go to the con with deep imposter syndrome. And I think there's nothing more satisfying than walking out on the floor with a fully finished costume piece. Yes, I have finished costumes before, but most of those have gone back and gotten upgrades where I said, you're gonna get upgrades, like Senator Anakin Skywalker last year. The reason it didn't feel the way that I feel now is because I knew that I was gonna do something with it. But with this one, there's nothing else I can do. I didn't mention the underwear. I made elven underwear for this whole costume. So, in about February, late February, early March, I also make a full elven underwear shirt with lace insertion, all this stuff. I make, like, eyelets on the sides. I make handmade needle lace on, like, the fronts of the coat and also on the under, like, pants, like the boxers. I make everything, right? So there's something terrifying about showing this work of love to people who are going to only look at it critically because they only have time to look at it critically. They don't really have time to just, like, look at it. And so when I went in for prejudging, I was walking around a little bit and I felt really good in my costume and, I felt seen. It was fine. But, there's something so terrifying because contests aren't won on stage. They're won in that room. And, it's up to what everybody else brings. It's not up. You can bring your best, but someone just does it better. And so I, in that prejudging room, have to recount the last 9 months in 5 minutes. And, obviously with the help of this, it worked, but, a build book can only do so much, Can only do so much. And, yeah. So then I get to go on stage. And, it's maybe like 6 p.m. I'm very tired. It won't hit me for like the next 4 days what just happened. I go on this stage, and for 1 minute, everybody gets to see the entirety of this work, the entirety of the 9 months that I just spent working on this thing, accidentally, I might add. And then it's over. It's all over, the costume is done. There's nothing else you need. There's no feedback to get. There's not a lot, though I did get feedback, and the only thing I got was that it's a little too much, which, understandable. We just recounted the whole story. It didn't hit me until I started driving home, and then I realized that I don't have upgrades to do. That this costume isn't getting another piece. That I am not remaking a whole thing. That I can move on. Do you know what freedom feels like? Because I don't. And it was sad. It's a little bittersweet because you kind of grow attached to the same thing. You grow attached to seeing this costume. You look at it and you're like, these are the last 9 months of my life. This is what I poured my soul into. I obsessed over this costume for 9 months straight with no break except for maybe 1 or 2, 3 weeks at most for the Loki that I had to do, and I really didn't want to do it. I don't know. I feel this weird attachment. I know it sounds crazy to say. You're like, but there's so much more. And every day I was like, I could do so many more costumes. This wasn't supposed to be my crown piece this year. I had desperately wanted to do something else, but it turned out to be because it just kept going. And I don't know. It was just bittersweet. I think saying goodbye to a costume, like saying goodbye to like a crafting era is really hard. In January, we entered the Inception era, the era of time. And that kind of sort of describes this whole thing, because with the Interstellar era, it was like this new sprouting thing, and then with the Inception era, it was finally like closing this chapter of a book. And when I got home, the chapter of the book closed. It was done. And that felt really weird, because I do have this attachment, because I remember all these things about it. I remember making things about it. I remember moments in time and knowing exactly where I was on this costume and how it all came together and how I've learned and grown from that moment and how my work has changed. And now we're here. Like I said, they don't warn you about the emptiness after you finish a crown build, after you finish a huge build. It's this weird hole where you're like, what do I do next? Because then you have to either go bigger or better, or you have to find some way to do more, or do something else. And yeah, obviously you could go down, and I am going to do a couple of small things, but I don't know. It feels weird to say goodbye to such a thing, so that's why I'm making this whole thing. Because it's time to say goodbye to a build that I've been doing and working for and on for months. And it's not that this build gets thrown away and never used again. No, I will wear this for as long as I possibly can because I love it so much. But the fact that I'm never working on something new for it is gonna feel weird. But at this point I can't. I have so many more things that I want to do now. And now I have the knowledge to do them. And that's really exciting. Hi, I'm Zach, and I accidentally spent 8, 9, 10 months on a build, and now I'm doing the next one, which hopefully is not going to take as long. It shouldn't, because it's not as difficult. I need to not make difficult builds. So that was my little story. That was my story time. That was my 30-minute story. I have clips of me getting dressed in the costume, in between, right? If you want to see more, if you want to see what I do next after this gigantic build, you can absolutely subscribe. I'm trying to do actual YouTube more, but I'm kind of slow when it comes to posting. I apologize. I work on embroidery, which takes time. But yeah, hopefully we'll see you again. Maybe I'm gonna post again frequently, maybe not. Goodbye.